right now. Okay. A little too much of noise is coming today. Buses and autos and all this. Okay. And Riaz, if possible, then you switch off the microphones from your end.
I'll start, sir.
Please do, Hasina, please. Syllabus. Hasina, there is a problem with your camera.
We are seeing you from the side.
Yeah.
Is it okay now?
No, you have to turn your.
Just a minute.
Make it horizontal, Hasina.
Make it horizontal, right.
Okay.
Okay,
Yes.
fine, right. That's it.
Good morning, everybody. On behalf of the Department of English, Alia University, I welcome you all to the second plenary session of the International Webinar on Planetary Crisis and the Humanities Prospects in Theory and Praxis. Before we begin, I would like to request all the participants to put off the videos and keep their audios muted. And kindly take note that you do not start presenting the screen. It becomes very disruptive. If you have any questions for the speaker, kindly write it down in the chat box and you would read it out to the speaker at the end of the talk. Our esteemed guest today in this session is Professor Samantak Das. Welcome, sir.
Sorry to interrupt. I think either Hasina Di or someone, have you logged in two system like mobile and laptop?
Yes.
No, so you need to switch off ek ka mic, like both ka mic is on, so it's echoing.
Okay. Is it okay now?
Yes, fine.
Okay. So, so our esteemed speaker today is, in this session, is Professor Samantak Das. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Though the speaker has reservations about reading bios, still we have to keep up with the formality and do the customary address.
I sent you a bio. Read out the bio I sent you.
Yes, sir. With the due apology, I read out. Professor Samantak Das is Professor of Comparative Literature of the School of Cultural Texts and Records, Jadavpur University. He is also the Director of the university's Internal Quality Assurance Cell. Professor Das has written and lectured on 19th century literature, translation, the relationships between the biological sciences and literature, environment, ecology, rural development, and education in books, journals, magazines, and newspapers in India and abroad, including the Times Higher Education Supplement, Economic and Political Weekly, Interventions, International Journal of Post-Colonial Studies, the Times of India, the Statesman, the Telegraph, the Indian Express, the Hindu, Biblio, Outlook, among others. He has led or jointly led several national and international projects, including on language learning, digitizing ephemera, creating databases, and so on. Professor Das today would be speaking on COVID-19 and the threat to democracy. Certainly a very pertinent topic of discussion in the present time, with the new disease on the one hand and a global tendency towards curtailment of free democratic voice and thoughts on the other. Since it is democracy, I could not resist myself from speaking a line or two before handing over to the moderator. If President Abraham Lincoln said in his Gettysburg Address that the government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth, there are countless instances around the world where we see that this sacrosanct concept of democracy has undergone an ironical change. As Bernard Shaw said, the great thing about democracy is that it gives every voter a chance to do something stupid. So now, without further deliberations, let us now listen to Professor Das to see his take on the issue, and at the same time, on our part, let us think or rethink where we stand today in this diseased world. Thank you. Now the session will be chaired and moderated by Professor Amjad Hussain sir. Sir, are you there? It's over to you now.
Okay, thank you, Hasina, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to Professor Samantak Das. So you have heard about our speaker today, but one thing I think Hasina has missed about Professor Das. He also is a volunteer of an NGO that works for rural development for the last 30 years. So I think we have a speaker today who is not only a reclusive academic, but who works at the grassroots level, and therefore I think is deeply aware of the crisis that people face today, particularly the vulnerable section of the people. Thank you, and over to Professor Das.
Thank you, sir. And before I begin, there's some kind of echo happening somewhere. Before I begin, I just want to ask the organizers. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me here at the Alia University, of which I have extremely fond memories because I've been kind of involved with it right from the time it was being set up. So thank you again. And Tajuddin, just tell me how much time do I have? If I get an estimate of the amount of time I have, then I'll tailor my talk accordingly.
Samantak, you can talk about 45 minutes. That would be, and then after that we can take up questions.
বাবা অতক্ষণ ধরে কি বলবো কিছু
তাহলে তুমি আধ ঘন্টা বলো না, তাহলেই হবে। তুমি যা বলবে তাহলে। আরেকটা কথা, তুমি অন্য বায়োডেটাটা কি পড়তে বলছো? The other one that you have sent. অন্য বায়োনোটটা you have sent 2 bionotes.
I wanted to read the one which I sent, one I prefer.
I understand. So তুমি বলো না, তারপরে it will be more in a discussion mode. We'll be asking you questions and we'll have a chat. Okay,
great. ঠিক আছে, আর আরেকটা কথা, Taj, since you're online, I mean, should I speak in English, or I think most of the people here are Bangla speakers, but I always think it's necessary to communicate. So
sir, it's your choice, whatever you feel like. Okay, আমিও বাংলা বেশি পছন্দ করি, so it's no problem. আপনার যেরকম মনে হয়।
Right, okay, somebody, issue Saxena, you've said English very well. We shall let the colonialists prevail. Not to worry.
Okay then. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Also, please feel free to put questions in the chat. Yes, somebody has said English, please, with 3 Z's. How can I refuse?
Yeah.
Right. Right. So, first of all, what I'm going to say today is not in the form of a finished paper. It's more like a set of reflections which have struck me as the pandemic has been gathering steam since it sort of arrived at our shores sometime in February, and then took on greater urgency, and is now gradually, if the scientists are to be believed, heading towards something like a peak from whence it will plateau, and then with luck the numbers will start falling. More and more of us will get the disease, more and more of us will recover, and so on and so forth. Now, first of all, I don't know about everybody else who's here, but every day I think of my extraordinary good fortune in that I have not lost a livelihood. I have not lost a paisa in salary. In fact, my salary has actually gone up because recommendations for the increase of salary for college and university teachers was implemented during this period of lockdown. So I am incredibly fortunate. I'm also incredibly fortunate in that I am under no compulsion to leave home and go out to work every day in order to earn a living and support my loved ones. This, unfortunately, is not true for the overwhelming majority of people in our country. Professor kindly mentioned the fact that I've been working as a volunteer for a rural development organization, a very small non-government organization for well over 30 years now, 34 years now, since 1986, 87. And I have seen and I have heard the kind of devastation that this pandemic has already caused. Now, it's impossible to discuss all the effects of the pandemic, not least because these are not evenly spread, either across the world or even across a country, or indeed even across a city. I'm sitting in Kolkata, as I suspect many, if not most of you are, although some might be from elsewhere. And even in this city, there are distinct differences in terms of the response to the pandemic, depending upon your location, your class, your caste, your gender, your religion, and so on and so forth. If you happen to be a member of a minority community, which is shorthand for Muslims in our country, and poor and living in an overcrowded area, then your chances not only of contracting the disease, but of not being able to avail of necessary medical assistance is far higher, than of somebody like me, who is upper middle class, lives in a nice flat, and has all the right contacts because I happen to be working in Jadavpur University and so on and so forth. So we know this. None of this is new for any one of us. And we also know many people, including some who work in our homes, in order to enable somebody like me to be talking to you like this instead of doing housework. And these people who daily expose themselves to the infection in order to serve us. We've also seen on the streets and in other areas daily wage workers, laborers, and so on and so forth, who have little or no option when it comes to the pandemic. Now, what I'm going to talk about is the threat to democracy, and I shall frame my arguments in slightly general terms first, and then in terms of certain specificities having to do with our country. Please pardon me if I trample on a few delicate sensibilities as I am doing so. And I will begin by talking about two things that have happened as a result of the pandemic, which seems to be kind of universal. The first is the fact that no one has been left unaffected by the pandemic. You may or may not have fallen victim to COVID-19, the disease SARS coronavirus of 2019. But I'm certain that you know of others who have, and equally certain that it has affected you in profound ways, even if you have not been affected by it. Now, so to put it as simply and as bluntly as possible, I do not think any one of us today here, or I suspect indeed anywhere else in the world, with the exception of infants, I suppose, and really isolated, maybe a couple of thousand of them in the world. Not one of us is in the normal psychological state in which we tend to exist, or in which we existed before, let's say, the middle of March, or if you want to be more precise, the 24th of March, the evening of the 24th of March, when the first lockdown was imposed, and I use the word imposed advisedly on our country. So none of us is psychologically normal, if we judge normal to be the state in which we were prior to the pandemic hitting our shores. And another thing that we need to take into consideration, that this is not a stable state in which we are. If you recall, when the pandemic first came, and I suspect since most of you are either students or teachers in higher academics, that we thought it would go away fairly soon. If you remember, the last day of classes in colleges and universities across the country was Friday the 13th of March, after which all educational institutions in the country shut down. And when that happened, we had made no forward planning about it. At least no institution of higher education that I know of in the country had made any forward planning. There was no idea about what we would do in terms of teaching, in terms of evaluations. It was kind of assumed that this would be something which would inconvenience us that much for a month or so, and then we would be able to get back to normal, taking necessary precautions and so on and so forth. Or so it seems to me. There were a few of us who thought otherwise, and who felt that it was maybe necessary to take longer term plans. And I include myself in that list because I happen to have a brother, my only sibling, who lives in the successful middle class Indians, who has United States of America, and who lives in Seattle, which at that time, I'm talking of second week of March or thereabouts, was very much the hotspot for the pandemic in the US before it shifted coasts to come and stay in New York. It's now moved to the south. So my brother and I were speaking about the situation, and we thought that we needed to make plans. But of course, we are, and I am too insignificant to have any effect on either the university or the state administration. Although I try and tell people that we need to maybe think slightly longer term and so on and so forth. And then the lockdown happened. Now, I don't know about the rest of you. So the first point that I'm making is that the world is not in a rational, logical, if it ever was, frame of mind. Certainly all of us are existing in a mind space considerably different from that in which we were existing. We only, not the whole, West Bengal only, not the whole country. I don't understand what you mean by that, sir. But we were existing, or perhaps, the closing down of classes. Okay, I mean, as far as I know, it was pretty much across the country, but you may be right. Yeah, so as I was saying, so our mind space is different. The second thing which I would want you to consider is the fact that time, our perception of time, and time is something which exists both externally as well as inside our heads, has changed considerably, so that we are no longer looking at temporality, looking at the way in which things happen in quite the same way. Just switched off my video because my internet's a bit unstable. So we are not, classes shut down over 5 months ago, and yet it seems only yesterday. On the other hand, the sense of continuity that we have of weeks passing into, days passing into weeks, passing into months, and so on and so forth, seems to have been disturbed. Many of my friends and acquaintances and I myself are hard put to name the day of the week when we wake up in the morning. It gradually comes back to us. Perhaps when we look at the paper or the calendar or increasingly our mobile phones, smartphones. But time seems to have both at one and the same time speeded up and slowed down at the same time. In fact, there's an interesting article that came out end of May in BBC, which I'm just giving you the link to that in the chat box. It's called "Why Time Seems to Be Going Faster While We Are in Lockdown," and this is the link. You can follow, and it's not only going faster, but it's also in strange ways slowed down. Again, I speak from anecdotal evidence of myself and some friends and relatives. Some days never seem to end, whilst others flash by without us even knowing what happened. I strongly suspect that if I were to ask any one of you, what were you doing in the middle of May, you would be hard put to answer. Under normal circumstances, with the school, college, and university year, proceeding and it's at its duly appointed pace, we would be able to say, oh, okay, in May, we were not going to class, the students were taking a break, semester exams were over, we were correcting scripts, blah, blah, blah. Now May seems to be pretty much the same as April, and April seems to be pretty much the same as July, which is exactly like that of June. And here we are on the 29th of August. And if you ask me what I've done all this month, I'd be hard-pressed to give you an answer. Despite the fact that I'm one of a handful of individuals in my university who have to go in on a fairly regular basis because I have all these other silly administrative duties. And yet my days have changed, time has changed. Now what all these two, our psychological instability, as it were, and the fact that time seems to have warped in peculiar ways, what this has done is this has put our future under a cloud. And when I say it's put our future under a cloud, what I mean is that we are unable to project into the future, 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, a decade down the line, and say with any degree of certainty that this is what I will be doing, or this is what we will be doing, or this is what my family will be doing, or my kids will be doing, or the world will be doing, or India will be doing, or West Bengal will be doing, with any degree of certainty. And the Supreme Court verdict yesterday, which is already being hotly debated and contested, has once again thrown the futures and fates of millions of our students in disarray. 10 million by some estimates, about 1 crore. I don't know about the exact numbers. But all of these young people, aged between 21 and 25 or thereabouts, for the most part, they went through this period of uncertainty when their classes abruptly stopped. Some who were studying in private universities had the resumption of classes several weeks afterwards. Others didn't. Some carried out communication with their peers and their teachers via electronic means, using WhatsApp and email and so on and so forth. Others didn't. But the whole thing was an absolute mess. They were naturally, the terminal semester students were naturally worried about their end semester examinations, how they would pass, when they would pass, and so on and so forth, and a whole host of suggestions, ideas, arguments came up, at the end of which, towards the end of April, a little over a month into the pandemic, on the 29th, if I remember correctly, the UGC comes out with an advisory, and there's a degree of relief, and various institutions start working out their own methods of dealing with it, some in consultation with students, others not. I know for a fact that in most of the IITs, consultations were held with students, as they were in my university. I also know that in some others they were not, but something was emerging. State governments were making plans. Our own government in West Bengal, after consultations with vice chancellors and so on, devised a formula so that the terminal semester students could finish their exams. And then, of course, it was all overturned last month, early July. And then it's been almost 2 months before a verdict from the Supreme Court. And I don't know what will happen. Now, this has tremendous shockwaves throughout the country, not only amongst the students who are there, but who are directly affected, but all students and teachers and their friends and relatives. It's a huge number which has been directly affected by this. I could cite many other examples on a global scale. I cited this because I am speaking at an institution of higher learning. But take, for example, the wearing of masks and whether we should wear masks, whether we should not wear masks, responses to the wearing of masks, some people refusing, the World Health Organization initially saying, well, it's not really necessary, then reversing its position. And now it seems to be clear that masks should be worn, especially in confined spaces. The whole idea of airborne transmission, how long does do the droplets stay in the air? Is it a few minutes? Is it a few hours? What is the safe distance between people if they are speaking with each other in an enclosed space, wearing masks, in an enclosed space without masks, outside wearing masks, outside not wearing masks, and so on and so forth and so on and so forth, almost unendingly. What I'm saying is that the certainties and the certitudes that we take for granted without really even thinking about them, and I think all of us here are probably of that age when we have not directly experienced any kind of state of emergency. I don't mean the political emergency, like a war or getting our cities bombed or the threat of bombing directly. And even when those things happen, they did not last for very long. So what I'm saying is that we are completely unprepared for it. And quarantine centers, most of the common persons in fear of that. Yes. Rajendra Singh's babies. Yeah. Okay, maybe I'll come back to stories later on. Now, what I'm saying is that all of these things have made us, pretty much all of us, particularly susceptible to control. And perhaps unfortunately, leaders, and I'm deliberately using the word leaders and not political leaders, leaders everywhere seem to be seeing this as an opportunity to extend their sphere of control and to try and guide us to do things or say things or act in ways which might eventually go against our own best interest. And the reason why such leaders are finding willing followers, if you like, is because we are in the state where, as I said, our psychological state is such that we are especially vulnerable and especially susceptible to this kind of figure who is going to give us certainty, who's going to give us reassurance. And on the other hand, because our sense of time and temporality has basically gone for a toss, we are unable to think in terms of the future, which typically we seem to divide into the immediate future, the middle term future, and the long term future. If you think about the political parties or the ideologies that you support or favor, and the people that you have voted for, you will see that typically we tend to vote in local elections and at national elections with a slightly sometimes different mindset. But one thing is common to the way in which we vote, and I'm using voting because that's a common experience for us. It could be about anything else. We look at the short and middle and long-term gains. Political parties and formations in India have been voted out of power because of immediate concerns. Other parties have hung on to power because of their promise of a certain stability. And most parties, when they prepare their manifestos, combine a short-term goal. I'm going to reduce poverty by so much. I will put 15,000 rupees into every Indian's bank account. I will do this, I will do that, we will do this, we will do that, with a longer-term vision of a certain kind of socialistic India where dams and factories are the temples of modern India, or the regaining of a glorious Hindu past, blah, blah, blah. These kinds of things are always there. And now we are in a situation where we do not even know what our state will be like on a day-to-day basis, where we will be like 6 months from now. One question that seems to haunt every one of us is, when will this end? Tragically, I think the answer is no one knows. And it will not really end in that sense. We will never go back to the old normal that we were used to earlier. Now, all of these makes it possible for individuals and organizations to come in with the promise of stability, with the promise of certainty, with the promise of a leadership which will at least lead us out of this current mess, and perhaps also take us towards a greater, more glorious future. If one thinks about the rise of authoritarian or fascist political groupings in the world, you will see that these invariably come to the fore after a time of crisis, especially an economic crisis, which naturally is accompanied by or the cause of social crisis. So the rise of National Socialism, and we need to remember that that's the full form of Nazi, in Germany in the late 20s and 30s, was preceded immediately by economic, political, and social instability. And that is what seems to be happening in various parts of the world. And that is the first reason why I think of this particular situation as bringing with it a real threat to democracy. Not because people are pushing things down our throat, but because we are in this peculiarly vulnerable position of being taken for a ride, as it were. I have been writing about these things, though not precisely from this perspective, for a while, and maybe later, if Taj likes, I can send you links to some of my articles, including one that I wrote. Let me put that here. This was published in February, so not so long ago, but it already seems like an entire lifetime back, when the violent actions against Muslims in Delhi was taking place. And I wrote a kind of article in the Telegraph predicated on what happened on Kristallnacht, which was the night of November 8th, 9th, 9th, 10th, pardon me, 1938, where the houses and synagogues of Jews in Germany were vandalized. I'm putting the link here. That article was called "On Pogroms" in the Telegraph, and if anybody cares to read it, you will see that I identify certain characteristics of such reprisals against a particular group, the Jews in Germany in the late 1930s, in that case. And that particular case which I cite, but one can easily find parallels in our country today. Now, the second point that I wanted to make about this situation, which is again tied to the notion of time and temporality, and the question that we are asking, when is it going to end? So I will quickly, tell you what I think about it. Not that my thoughts really matter, but we have to start thinking about where we will be 6 months, 6 years, a decade from now. And it seems to me that, as Simon Mayer has written in a marvelous book, it's called COVID-19, A New World Disorder. Let me put that book title down here. It's called COVID-19, A New World Disorder, and it's published by CSE, the Center for Science and Environment, New Delhi. It's available as an ebook, which you can purchase for 300 rupees, which is what I did. And because I'm a supporter of the Center for Science and Environment, I'm not, emailing copies of this book to everybody here. I'd much rather that you bought it. Now, in this book, there's a lovely chapter called "What Will the World Be Like After Coronavirus" by Simon Mayer, M-A-I-R. And he begins by asking, where will we be in 6 months, a year, 10 years from now? I lie awake at night wondering what the future holds for my loved ones. And that is something that I've been talking about, the future. How are we looking at the future? And basically what he talks about is that there are, according to him, and I largely agree, he talks about 4 possible futures. One is what he calls a descent into barbarism, a kind of situation where little groups are jockeying for power within or outside of national boundaries. If you remember the bad old days in Afghanistan, where the Taliban and other warlords were fighting over different parts of the country, something like that. Second, what he calls a robust state capitalism. A robust state capitalism, to me, the most important word there is state, where you don't discard capitalism with all its flaws and problems, but you give the state considerable oversight. Now, this is the sort of robust state capitalism that we've seen working successfully in a country like Japan, for example, or in several of the Scandinavian countries. A state and interventionist state capitalism with features of redistributive justice and with certain almost socialist systems in place, as we have seen most notably amongst the larger nations in somewhere in a country like Germany. In states where state control over capitalist enterprises is relatively less, or where in certain ways these capitalist enterprises control the state and policy making by the state, such as, for example, most notably in the United States of America, things are in a right royal mess, as we know, and I don't need to develop on that. The third is a radical state socialism, which, if you ask me, one is unlikely to see, except perhaps in smaller countries, although I think all states will necessarily have to put into place certain safety nets and features of the welfare state simply in order to protect the interests of capital, even in large capitalist economies, avowedly so, which are avowedly so, such as, once again, the United States of America. There will have to be systems in place, if nothing else, in order to protect capitalists' interests by ensuring that their workers are not dying left, right, and center. Think about the situation that has happened in our country as a result of what the completely unplanned way in which the first lockdown, which I call lockdown 1.0, if you like, happened. A lockdown was imposed with 4 hours notice. Millions of migrant workers were stuck. All sorts of schemes were cobbled together right at the last minute. And most of them were able to return home over the next several months, often at horrific cost to themselves. But now that they are back home, and we all know this, many of these migrant workers are simply refusing to go back to their places of work, even when they are being offered unthought of perks, such as, for example, being flown out by plane, by doubling of their wages, and so on and so forth. The migrant workers are saying, no, we may just about exist above the subsistence level, but we'd much rather do it at home, in a familiar environment, surrounded by familiar people, within a familiar culture, than go to some alien place and we don't know what's going to happen. The shock of what happened to the migrant workers as they were essentially abandoned both by their employers and the state, one or two notable exceptions always notwithstanding, is going to have very long-term effects on the Indian economy. And this has already started to manifest itself. So irrespective of whether a country depends on migrant labor or on the unorganized sector, the state will necessarily have to put into place certain welfare schemes and extend the reach of already existing schemes. And the final possibility that Simon Mayer looks at is a transformation into a big society built on mutual aid. This, of course, is the sort of quasi-socialist paradise that many of us dream of, where we are helping each other out, dependent on our mutual concern for each other in order to help build a society. Yes, Rohan, you're right. Labor laws have been changed too in a time of crisis like this, etc. I wrote a little bit about this, about what is happening in education and the lessons that we could take away from it. This was published in the Telegraph yesterday. And with due apologies, I'm sending you a link here about how I think the model of education, especially in higher educational institutions, is showing us the benefits of cooperation rather than of competition, and the need for teachers and students to develop certain kinds of interdependencies. Yes, in fact, how do you contextualize the varying degrees and types of vulnerability? Yeah, okay. Padmanath Trivedi, I'll come back to you in a moment. I have another 5 minutes to go, and I'll quickly sum up, therefore, the last part of my talk. So the second part had to do with possible futures. I personally see in India over the next, say, decade or so, several conflicting stories and narratives that are going to emerge. There will be undoubtedly a rise of various kinds of cultism. I call it cultism, whether this is Hindutva, nationalism, whether this is radical Islam, millennial Christianity, which you find in certain northeastern states and so on and so forth, because people will be drawn to charismatic leaders talking about a future, glorious, a glorious future, whether for the individual or the collective. So there will definitely be a rise in superstition, unfounded faith, and so on and so forth, because we've all had our spiritual base shaken. The second thing that I see is that political parties of all hues and, covering the entire spectrum, are going to try and exploit the situation and the period of economic certainty the economic uncertainty, the period of economic uncertainty that will follow. If the coronavirus were to leave our shores on Monday, the 31st of August, and if we were entirely COVID-19 free from the 1st of September, there would still be at least 5 years or more that we need in order to recover economically, not least because the world economy itself is in a shambles, and so much of India's economic strength and standing in the world is derived from the services that we produce, especially in IT and software. And there's simply no takers for such IT and software anymore. I'm not saying no takers, but the markets have stopped. Manufacturing has gone askew and so on. So it'll take us 5 years to reboot and start getting back to economic activities and so on and so forth. And this will have a multiplier effect down the line. So we'll be in a state of economic uncertainty. Right. Having come this far, I'll just quickly take you through the sort of things that we as ordinary citizens can do. And I'm taking these from a book called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. Let me put that down. This is the name of the book, on Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the Century by Timothy Snyder. Let me just check. Yeah, Timothy Snyder. It's a little book. About less than 100 pages long, and it is published in 2017. And these are the 20 points that Tim Snyder makes. If you Google Timothy Snyder on YouTube, you will come across some of his very nice interviews, including one with Trevor Noah, where he talks about this book. So these are the things that he says, and I will end by just enumerating them, and then maybe we can go on to questions. Number one, do not obey in advance. This is what, as I was trying to say, there is a tendency for us to do. If somebody comes to us promising us an explanation of our present situation and giving us an explanation of our present situation and promising us a certain future, we will likely want to obey that person. So do not obey in advance. Number two, defend institutions. This, I think, is the need of the hour, especially for us, those of you who are like me, who are already part of an institution called the university. We have to start defending our institutions. We have to start defending the autonomy of our institutions and protecting them from these orders which are sought to be imposed upon us, whether by our political masters or by institutions or structures like the Ministry of Human Resource Development, which is shortly going to be renamed the Ministry of Education, the University Grants Commission, and so on and so forth. Number three, beware the one-party state. I find it's very interesting that in countries where there has been a kind of creeping authoritarianism arising out of majoritarianism, such as in Turkey, such as in the United States of America, and such as, sadly, in our own country, speakers of at least one political formation, typically the one in power, is saying that we are going to be here forever. There'll be just a one-party state. One-party states have existed. The only places where one-party states have existed are in very closed, very harsh, very authoritarian regimes in China right at the moment, North Korea, and so on. Number four, take responsibility for the face of the world. We have to tell ourselves that we may be small, we may be insignificant, but somewhere we too are responsible for what the world is like. Number five, remember professional ethics. This is one of the things that tends to go out the window when you're faced with a crisis. But we are all, I suspect most of us here are engaged in professions, and there is a fairly well laid out code of conduct, if you like, not to be confused with the code of conduct imposed on us and certain ethics and norms that we follow. We have to remember them. We cannot abandon them. Number 6, be wary of paramilitaries. Number 7, be reflective if you must be armed. Number 8, stand out. That again is another thing that we need to think about. There is a tendency in a term of crisis to give in to the herd mentality. Don't be afraid to speak out, even if you are in a minority of one. I have done it in my own small way on a couple of occasions, and not because I'm a particularly brave person, I'm not, but because I thought that was the right thing to do or say at that moment. And I've always found support, always, without exception. Be kind to our language. Yes, this is something that we need to think about. One of the things that happens in a time of crisis like this is the debasement of language. We have to use language with due respect for it, with with honor, with subtlety. Believe in truth. That's another thing. We are being told we live in a post-truth world. We don't. There are certain large truths about the world which we need to discover. And in order to do that, number 11, investigate, find things out. We are fortunate right now, everybody who's listening to this, and I see there's some 90 odd of people here. We can actually investigate even from the privacy of our homes using the resources of the internet. Make eye contact and small talk. This, well, difficult in a pandemic situation where we are asked to isolate ourselves. But yes, I think the point that Snyder is making is, it's necessary to build up these little groups of solidarity. Practice corporeal politics, politics of the body. Establish a private life. Well, we have all been asked to establish a private life, and I can talk about the paradoxes there. But what Snyder is saying in this book is, have a life outside of your work, outside of your institution, a place where there's cooperation, not competition, a place where you value a person not because how much money she has or what she has achieved, but simply because she is or he is what he is or she is. Contribute to good causes. Again, it makes you feel good for yourself, and it gives tremendous support to the people who are running these good causes. And of course, cleverly, Snyder puts it at number 15 because you need to determine for yourself what these good causes are. Number 16, learn from peers in other countries. Look at what teachers in other countries are doing. Look at what governments in other countries are doing. Ask your government to do that. I think one of the problems that we faced from most state governments in India during the pandemic is the tendency to not give out information, tendency to keep data and statistics to themselves. If you look at the places which have tackled the pandemic best, such as, for example, Germany or the Indian state of Kerala, you will see that they've been honest and upfront with the people whom they are serving. So we can learn from our peers in other countries. Listen for dangerous words. There are certain words which ought to set off alarm bells. And I shall not spend time talking about these words in our context to know what they are. Number 18, be calm when the unthinkable arrives. I found it instructive to read it again because the unthinkable has, in a sense, arrived, and we need to be calm. In the first month of the pandemic here, I wrote a piece where I said that neither, unthinking casualness or terrified panic is useful. And I think I'm hopeful that we've moved from that terrified panic mode into something more rational and reflective, although I fear that we've just gone back to our old casual ways and saying it doesn't matter, nobody's dying, mask, I won't wear a mask, whatever, and things will go from bad to worse. We have examples of other countries. Be a patriot. I think that's very important. And also be perfectly aware that being a patriot doesn't mean supporting the political party in power, whether in the state or in the at the center. I know I'm a tremendously patriotic Indian, but I have strong differences with the government that is running our country at this moment. Being a patriot means loving your country, being willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for your country, not the state, not a prime minister who's using the army for photo ops and so on and so forth. And finally, number 20, be as courageous as you can. And on that note, without any further ado, I would like to end here saying that each one of us is capable of minor acts of courage and heroism, and we should not shy away from these acts due to personal misgivings or fear. Thank you very much. Taj, I have taken up more time than I thought I would. So if there's still time for questions, I'll be perfectly happy to take them. Thank you all.
Amjad sir, it's over to you now. So Amjad sir and Hassan. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Das, for your brilliant talk. I'm saying brilliant is not just a kind of hackneyed phrase, but indeed it was indeed very brilliant, very illuminating. So thank you for that. I think if I just want to summarize what, it's a very long one, but I'll attempt to summarize a little bit. I think you emphasized on firstly 2 points that you see the pandemic situation that came to us in a way created a kind of instability, a kind of irrational mind set among us, and we were not in a kind of rational frame of mind, and this kind of psychological instability, I think you mentioned, that contributes to the rise of fascism and authoritarianism. Yes, the uncertainties have vanished, and that is why people have become susceptible to control, being controlled by people in power. And then also you emphasize that these are the times when authoritarian and fascist groupings, particularly during the time of economic crisis, take the opportunity to come to power, to come to fore. Second point that you mentioned particularly is you referred to Simon Mayer's book, A New World Disorder. And there you talked about the 4 possibilities particularly that might happen in this situation. I just briefly mentioned it. He talks about descent into barbarism, and then either this one or the second possibility is robust state capitalism, or another possibility is a kind of radical state socialism. Maybe even you see countries like ours who don't care much for their citizens, ordinary vulnerable citizens, in the interest of capitalism will be forced to put in place some safety nets. And also, you see, there might be a possibility of transformation of countries like countries in a kind of socialist paradise. For instance, you mentioned your article published yesterday in the Telegraph, where you talked about cooperation and solidarity among the teachers and the students. And then, of course, another possibility, but or decades or so, there will be rise of various kind of cultism, like Hindutva or nationalism or radical Islam, or the rise of superstition, etc. And of course, the political parties will take opportunity of these economic uncertainties because the market is down, and so people will tend to be susceptible to these kinds of easy solutions. So what can we ordinary citizens do in such situations? There you referred to the book by Timothy Snyder, and 20 lessons that he speaks of. First one is do not obey in advance. I just read out hurriedly. And then defend institutions, which is important. And then the third one is beware of one-party state. Yes, as you earlier mentioned, also these kind of economic and social instability leads to the rise of authoritarianism and militarism, particularly. And then we have to take responsibilities, however small we may be. We have to remember our professional ethics. We have to maintain our professional ethics, and then be aware of our, be wary of the paramilitary forces and others. We have to stand up. We have to speak up, even if we are in a minority. We have to be kind to our languages. We have to investigate. We have to make eye contact. We have to lift. We have to think of our institutions, defending our institutions, and we have to contribute to good causes. We have to learn from our peers and other countries. Someone is talking, I think, in between.
He's gone now.
Yes, we have to learn from our peers as well as other countries. We must not listen. We have to listen to also pay attention to some dangerous words. We must be aware of these words. And then we have to be calm, even if the unthinkable arrives. That is very important, I think, particularly in times of crisis like this. We suffer psychologically, so we have to remain calm, quiet, and then we have to be patriot. And you have very rightly explained that patriotism, loving one's country, does not mean loving the government or supporting the one party ruling party. And then, of course, we have to be courageous to face the current situation. So thank you very much. Now the session is open for Q&A session. Yes. Who will read out the questions? Rohan?
Okay, I'm just
Yes.
By the time you and Hasina look at the questions that is there in the chat box, okay, there are
Yes.
5 or 6 questions I can see. So I hope you will be able to forward the questions to the speaker, Samantak.
No, I've got the Taj. I've got the questions. I can start addressing the questions that were asked.
Okay. That you can do directly. Do directly.
Okay.
Mimi, Dishash, that seems to be quarantine centers. Most of the common persons in fear of death and disaster, failure of the system. Rajendra Singh Bedi's short story and some other writings. How do you like to interpret that? Well, I think every historical juncture and every situation of crisis somehow reminds us of the, significance or the renewed significance of certain stories. I've been reminded during this pandemic of Garcia Marquez's wonderful novel, Love in the Time of Cholera, and so many of his stories which deal with large-scale deaths and so on and so forth, where you can go back to them anew, and you can go back to them and find, discover this sense of human resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. One, of course, has thought about Albert Camus' La Peste, the plague, and what happens to the people of Oran in that plague. So yes, so whether it's a Rajendra Singh Bedi, whether it's a Garcia Marquez, or whether it's an Albert Camus, literature has this wonderful way of enabling us to go back to them and find new ways of seeing human beings and seeing the relationships between human beings and society. So thank you. Next question, Padmanabh Trivedi asks, when we use we, does it also incorporate marginalized people like sex workers, third genders, migrant laborers living in Bombay slums, for example, while talking about the effect of COVID-19 on democracy? How do you contextualize the varying degrees and types of vulnerability of the different types of sections in social hierarchy? Well, Padmanabh, I think the rest of my talk may perhaps have given you some kind of an idea, especially the 20 points that Timothy Snyder raises in his little, booklet, really. It's impossible in the space of such a brief talk to talk about all these different kinds of marginalized communities. The way in which, let's say, a trans person is marginalized is considerably different from the the way in which, let's say, a Bengali migrant from Murshidabad is marginalized in a Bombay slum or chawl, which in turn is different from the way in which sex workers are marginalized. One is hearing absolutely horrifying stories of the way in which certain forms of exploitation have gone up. Domestic violence has gone up by leaps and bounds. I was fortunate to be able to participate in a seminar organized by young people on the rise in domestic violence. That has gone up even in homes such as ours. The trafficking of young women, the buying, quote unquote, buying of women by paying their parents money and the lure of, within quotes, marriage. Bhashwati Chakraborty, Professor Bhashwati Chakraborty has a wonderful article about this day before in the Telegraph, where she speaks about this, and there are other reports which are coming out about this. So marginalized people everywhere tend to be amongst the first who are affected and who are brought under rigorous draconian control. If you think about what happened to the gypsies, to homosexuals, apart from the Jews, in Italy, for example, or in Germany under fascist rule, you'll see what I mean. And the way in which China is cracking down on certain minorities right now is, again, pretty horrifying. And in every instance, this happens because of a lack of democratic space where people cannot speak up for their rights and so on. I mean, we've seen this in our own country, have we not? The way in which the national education policy was passed at such a time with no discussion in Parliament is just symptomatic of the way in which people who already have power are going to use our vulnerable state to pass through legislation, pass through laws, which we are no longer in a position perhaps to oppose because we are too busy trying to save our own lives. So yes, marginal people are going to be in bad shape. Pleasure to hear you. When COVID-19 is threatening the democracy, what do you think the fourth pillar of democracy, the media, is playing? Okay, sadly enough, I think what has happened in India is that the media has, again with a few notable exceptions, given up its role of impartial reporting. I've stopped watching television because I can't find a single unbiased television channel. It's no longer news, it's mostly views. And these are rammed down our throats. Things are equally bad in social media. And one of the problems that you have in social media, and I've spoken about this and written about it elsewhere, is that you typically tend to speak into a bubble in which others like you are there. So, pretty much whatever your position on let's say, the CAA, NRC, NPR, if you are in a WhatsApp group or in any other social media fora, your friends on Facebook are likely to be those who agree with you. I think one of the great roles that media ought to play in a democracy is bringing people together who don't have the same opinions and the same ideas, and setting up a place where they can debate, discuss. That doesn't happen. So the media has by and large, failed us. There are, of course, certain exceptional individuals and certain exceptional media houses which are trying to be impartial. And I'm not talking of those who are equally partial. One of the interesting things that has happened is that the media, both on the right and the left, have become more rigid in their stance. So if the media on the right is saying that whatever the BJP government is doing is good, the media on the left is saying whatever the BJP government is doing is bad. And there have been some measures taken by the government in the center which are good. There have been others which have been terrible. But simply because your media house or you personally are on the left doesn't mean you attack everything that the government is doing, whether at the center or at the state. And likewise, because you're a supporter of the government, my government or my party, right or wrong, is the wrong thing to do. Media is supposed to be, as far as possible, impartial. And we can learn from journals like The Guardian in Britain, like the New York Times in the United States of America, like Der Spiegel in Germany, which present balanced and unbiased views for the most part, which enables ordinary citizens to make up their minds. That is something that the media, I fear, is failing to do in our country. But the great hope, the great possibility is that we as individuals now have far greater reach than we did earlier. I'm fortunate. I happen to write for a national daily on a monthly basis, The Telegraph. Not all of you are as fortunate as I am, but there is the possibility of using social media to spark discussion and debate, but we need to go that extra mile to do it, because the tendency will be to speak to others like us. We need to engage in discussions and debates and arguments even with those who don't think like us. That is the need of the hour, so perhaps we could do it. Anubhav Haq said this is a pandemic, but sadly it has become another tool of politics. Ruling one will this affect the whole political atmosphere throughout the world as people witness power politics, blah, blah, blah. Is there any possibility? Yes, Anubhav Haq. I think there is every possibility of that, and we are seeing it happen. We are seeing the way in which there is the rise of the strong man, Vladimir Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, Boris Johnson in the UK, Donald Trump in the US, Xi Jinping consolidating power in China, and in our own country, they who should not be named are doing the same thing. The problem, or I think but paradoxically, the pandemic also offers us this opportunity of seeing that these human beings are also human. They are not supermen or women. They are vulnerable. Think about the fact that Boris Johnson of Britain, who had a strong anti-immigration stance, fell ill, had to be hospitalized, and was cared for by two nurses, both of whom happened to be immigrants. I'm sure that has affected him. Even if it hasn't, it has affected people's perception of him. Right now, our Home Minister is affected by COVID-19, I believe, and maybe still in hospital. So that aura of invincibility takes a bit of a beating. So even as the pandemic creates a situation for the rise of the strong man or woman occasionally, it also shows up the vulnerability of such strong men who typically come to us presenting themselves not so much as strong men as Ubermensch, supermen. And their supermanhood is challenged. The best sort of leadership that this pandemic has seen has come, interestingly enough, for the most part from women. And I'm not being, reverse sexist here, but if you think about New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, I think I keep mispronouncing her surname. If you think of Germany, where Angela Merkel has done a wonderful job. If you think of the health minister of Kerala, again, whose name is, escaping me at this moment. So it is women who have shown leadership. And I'm not essentializing, but because women are typically conditioned to think beyond their own narrow, petty interests, maybe there's something to be learned from there without using the labels feminine and masculine. I think a kind of macho posturing that some of these strong men are doing, if you contrast it with the way in which these other leaders have gone ahead. And this has happened on part of male leaders as well. It has happened in South Korea. I'm deliberately not speaking of tiny nation states like Singapore and Hong Kong because, Hong Kong is in a bit of a mess. But other larger states, the three Scandinavian countries, apart from Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, where there has been a sharing of information, where the government has said, look, this is what we are doing. We are not certain. Right now in Germany, they are reopening schools. And what the German government has done is it has said, okay, we are going to try and reopen it. But if it doesn't work, we will admit our errors and we'll come back. If the leader or leaders or the spokespeople of a party come to you as human beings, as fallible human beings like you and me, and tell you what they're doing and why they're doing it, then they are far more likely to carry all of us along with them than if they come and present themselves as infallible superhuman beings who can predict the future. Our Prime Minister said, the Kurukshetra war was won in 18 days. We will have this thing defeated in 21 days. It's been, I don't know, about however many days since he said it, and shows no signs of going away. So yes, there will be this tendency of strong arm tactics of strong men emerging, for the most part men, but also I think the pandemic allows us to show these people that they are human, that they are fallible, and that maybe, and this is all that I can do, I keep hoping, and it's not unfounded hope. It's hope because I see it operating in my own small sphere, at home, in my neighborhood, in my university, in the NGO. People can come together and cooperate. Dissent of any kind is being suppressed with absolute impunity. How do you propose ostracism and even personal Facebooks are leading to jail sentences? Well, that's the problem, isn't it? And Rohan, this is Rohan Hassan. This was happening before the pandemic. Come on. This was happening from before the pandemic. And again, the pandemic has just given the opportunity to authoritarian forces to sort of quietly slip under the radar. And, Bharara Rao has been refused bail. Sudha Bhardwaj's bail was refused today. Others are being picked up. Let's be absolutely clear about the fact that there are powerfully authoritarian tendencies amongst the ruling parties in India. Not all of them, but certainly the one that is at the center. And that they will use this opportunity to try and take away our freedoms, to try and imprison us on the basis of a Facebook post. Who knows? The sort of things that I've been saying in this lecture might bring a reprimand or something like that. I hope it doesn't, but it might. That kind of thing is happening. In educational institutions, vice chancellors are issuing orders saying that you cannot speak against the government, as if these are people who are signing the service rules of joining the military. These things were happening before the pandemic. They will happen during the pandemic, and I fear that their incidence will only go up after we have brought the pandemic under some kind of control, or, as seems more likely, we have learned to live with the pandemic. These will not go away, and eternal vigilance is the price of peace and democracy. We will have to keep fighting. We will have to keep opposing. We will have to keep using all the resources at our disposal to try and combat these forces. I find it my way of life that people are generally carried away by the emotion, not reason. Uncertainty makes me more vulnerable to emotional mindset. Yes. Reason over emotion in terms of a post-COVID political future. Well, reason and logic are things that we need to practice, and especially those of us who are present here today, some 78 of us down from 93 at the highest point, we need to do it because I think we are trained to do it. We have been taught to do it, and it is our responsibility, not just to confine what we do within the classroom or within the home, but also try and reach out to larger numbers of people. That's the only way in which you can spread reason, by showing people the irrationality of certain kinds of decisions, banging pans and pots. Unfortunately, let me make a small intervention here. Unfortunately, we are, for whatever reason, maybe the several thousands of years of the caste system or whatever, and feudalism, we have a certain kind of feudal mindset. So scientists, I was appalled to see a scientist at a reputed institution actually write a paper. Fortunately, it didn't get published, but he sort of self-promoted it on social media, saying how the idea of banging these pans and pots was brilliant because the sound waves would affect the virus. Like complete and utter nonsense and rubbish. So, yeah, we need to, and I agree, it is far more difficult to be a champion of reason when the seductions or the seductiveness of unreason is so powerful. But we have to try. We have to try and do it. And we need to take inspiration from others around us who are doing it, whether these be our friends, family, teachers, public intellectual. Somebody like Ravi Kumar, for example. Talking of media, we need to do this. Camelia Paul writes, under the 9th point title, be kind to our language, avoid pronouncing the phrases everyone else does. Why do you think the author is referring to the catchphrase, some of us take up to time to appear cool, or maybe we lack the ability to articulate properly? Both. I think both. Catchphrases, politicians, the genius of politicians of all shades, whether on the left or the right, has been their ability to encapsulate a complex idea into a simple phrase. Mahatma Gandhi, each one teach one, was one of his phrases. Each one teach one, brilliant. During Indira Gandhi's time, in fact, during the emergency, work more, talk less, brilliant phrase. Buddhadev Bhattacharya in our own country in the dying days of the CPM spoke about do it now. Don't sit around doing it, do it now. And our present chief minister has a way with words. In fact, the slogan, Ma Mati Manush, is strongly evocative. The BJP under Narendra Modi, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. These are powerful phrases. These are catchphrases. But very often, not always, but very often, they hide a more authoritarian kind of tendency underneath. And so it is necessary for us to not give in to these catchphrases, but to try and, as it were, deconstruct them, disentangle them, to try and find what these might be hiding, what these might be doing. Substituting a catchphrase with another catchphrase is not always very useful. What happens in most of these sort of slogans that come up, Hum do, Hamare do, and so on and so forth, which was, I think, a fantastic slogan for the family planning program, as it used to be called then. Each one teach one again, absolutely marvelous. But then we need to ask ourselves, when somebody's saying each one teach one, is he sort of saying that there's no responsibility on part of the state to set up institutions of higher education? So we need to look at it skeptically. We need to read these texts skeptically. We lack the ability to articulate properly. Well, if we do, then it is our responsibility to teach ourselves how to articulate properly. There are enough examples around us in our public life, in our journals and magazines. Read them, understand them, and try and develop the ability to articulate correctly yourself. I think that's a responsibility each one of us has to take on individually. Hasina Wahida, do you think that we are moving towards a state of moral vacuity, you misspelled vacuity, and humanitarian crisis? How acceptable is it that while on the one hand we are developing artificial and on the other we are being blind? Yes, we are. I find this notion of moral vacuity or a moral vacuum somewhat perplexing. We human beings are moral creatures. We are moral animals. In that, when we contemplate undertaking an action, there is a kind of moral imperative that works behind us, even if we have not articulated it ourselves. If you're, in a shop and you see a lovely little trinket and the shop owner is not there, and you know that there's no CCTV, you quickly pocket that trinket or not. If you don't, then at that point you're probably not thinking of the moral imperative not to steal, but it's working there. So when one speaks of moral vacuity or a moral vacuum, I really think it has to be, I would probably say moral confusion rather than moral vacuity. And I think what happens is that our sense of morality gets confused at this moment. Let me remind you again of something that I said right at the beginning of my talk. I am painfully aware of the fact that I can say all of these grand and wonderful sounding things, that I have the time to think and reflect and write about these matters, because I am not existing in a state of economic uncertainty. A lot of people, even in my economic class, pretty much right towards the top of the economic ladder in India, are facing this economic uncertainty. My friends, some of my friends who hold extremely responsible and well-paid positions have had pay cuts up to 70%. Some have lost their jobs. Now, if I were to have lost my job, and if somebody said, well, okay, we will take you on for half the pay that you're getting or were getting at the other university, but you can't say anything against or anything about ... blah, 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 and so on and so forth. If I had to accept a job under those circumstances only in order to keep body and soul together, I honestly do not know what I would do. It is easy to take the moral high ground and to make these grand statements when one is not otherwise at the clutches of somebody who's paying to keep body and soul together. And that is what is happening. A lot of people are being given jobs. You know, in private universities, there are all of these clauses. You can't speak against the university. You can't, criticize the government, blah, blah, blah. All of these things are there. Fortunately, I can speak about the government, which pays my salary. And so far, nobody has done anything about it. But it's easy to be morally righteous when your belly is full. Not so when it isn't. Shomoru, slightly Artho witnessed the violence of the plague, a possibility of reorienting our culture, beginning in Artho, I honestly don't remember what you're talking about. I think Kamu did. Kamu thought about the plague, and the plague, La Peste, is seen as a kind of parable about fascism, the rise of fascism and how it engulfs everyone. I have a slightly different take on the plague, Kamu's novel, in that the great absences in the plague. First of all, the Arabs. It is set in an Arab town. There are no Arab characters, as it were, except as background, which again is the same thing you find in Camus' L'Étranger, the outsider, sometimes translated the stranger, with Mayor Salt. He shoots an Arab. The Arab is never given a name. So Camus, for all his socialist sympathies, at one time membership of the Communist Party, is again strangely blind to the plight of those who are not like him, which is interesting given that he was actually Algerian and probably had some Arab blood in him as well, like Derrida. He was Algerian, he was a colon, somebody born in a colony, and yet he was blind to this. Nevertheless, having accepted the failings and drawbacks of the plague, it is possible to answer your question in the affirmative. Yes, I think the pandemic offers us an opportunity, if not to wipe the slate entirely clean, but at least to try and think of a new way of organizing ourselves. I'm saying ourselves and not society, because society is too big a word, but perhaps it is possible for us to reorient ourselves. I think one of the things the pandemic has done is it has forced us to rethink our priorities, whether when it comes to activities or to other human beings. Most of us have now realized which friends we cannot live without. Most of us have realized which activities we cannot live without, as it were. We have had to prioritize. And I think what a lot of us, including myself, have discovered is how much time we wasted, frittered away on unnecessary and silly things, and we are not doing it now. And it's fine. Also, I think despite the fact that all of this technology was around us, we didn't use it. This is probably the 7th or the 8th or the 9th webinar I've attended in these last few months. And I think webinars have been wonderful in one respect, in that they've allowed us to listen to people from all across the world. So maybe after we go back to something like normal, we go back to the new normal, as is now being said, a part of sort of regular seminars and lectures will be addresses from people, scholars and thinkers, activists from across the world using electronic means. So yeah, there are possibilities which are emerging. But as I write in my piece published in the Telegraph yesterday, whether we take up those possibilities and develop them, build on them or not, ultimately depends on us. Government as well as I want to talk about home quarantine, but doesn't make any sense to people in our country. If it is, then how? Well, home quarantine, of course, depends on whether you have a home or not. So if I got ill, home quarantine would make sense. In fact, one of my colleagues at Jadavpur University contracted COVID-19 along with his wife and mother, stayed at home and recovered because, of course, his disease did not spiral out of control. So home quarantine can work if you are fortunate enough to have a home where you can quarantine yourself. Yeah, it can work. However, if you happen to live in a slum, as 60% of those who live in Kolkata do, or are a poor laborer living in a thatched hut or half-broken building with a cracked asbestos roof somewhere in a village, then it's going to be difficult for you. If you agree with the decisions and political Golima, what's your take on that? Well, Miraj, Malik, I have been called anti-national in print and I have received death threats. I think it's a badge of pride for us today. I feel proud of the fact that the ruling party calls me anti-national. Competent opposition, yeah. Ishu Saxena, I agree with you. The opposition has largely failed. I'm going to ask you directly if you allow. I will in a row. It's Kim Jong sisters, more terrifying. Socialism. Well, I've just Case Halaja. Thank you, Ron. Yeah. I don't want to genderize it, but on the evidence, and I think I tried to explain why I think that is happening, because women are taught, conditioned, brainwashed, whatever you like, to think about others, not just themselves. Whereas men who start out as boys are usually told you have to look out for number one. We men are coached in the ethics of competition, whereas women who start out as girls are usually coached in the ethics of cooperation. And I think that is happening. I think all of us need to be coached in the ethics of cooperation, as I've argued in my piece yesterday. Banking policy, assessing how much people follow the direction. Yeah, I agree. How should we look at this particular? Come on, Nawaz Sharif. The sad thing is that right now, even our judiciary seems to be failing us. I'm not saying this, because I want to be like Prashant Bhushan and, be contemptuous of the Supreme Court. But the recent decision has really led me to despair. I'm sure that there are good legal points which have been quoted in the judgment. I haven't read the full judgment yet of the Supreme Court delivered yesterday. But it seems to me that this is a kind of one-sided judgment. It doesn't seem to have it has no academic justification, because if you think about the semester system, which is pretty much in place everywhere, most students, and this I've argued again in another piece in the Telegraph, will have finished 85, 90% of their assessments. Why this insistence on conducting the terminal end semester examination? I really honestly don't know. So who's going to hold whom accountable? Who's going to hold the media accountable? These are difficult times. Blessed situation. Yes, M. Banerjee. I don't know who you are. I mean, I know you're M. Banerjee. Yes, I think so. That is the fear. I don't know whether you've seen the news article which came out, I think, yesterday, saying that all central universities have stopped recruitment. And Yeah, they have, and they're definitely going to try and use this to say, look, online classes work, distance education works, webinars work, so we are not going to pay money to anybody to organize seminars. What's the point? You spend a few thousand rupees and you organize a webinar. So yeah, that tendency will be there. You see, because even the national education policy keeps harping on that same 6% of GDP, 6% of GDP, 6% of GDP. Well, our GDP is going to shrink. So 6% of GDP today or next year is not going to be the 6% of GDP that it was yesterday or the last year. And no way in hell are we going to get to 6% of GDP, pardon my language. So we'll be stuck at that 3% level. And the government is, and this government particularly is so fond of, spectacle and smoke and mirrors and showing off, that they will spend it on grand schemes like NIRF, this and that and the other. I could talk for hours about all of these, but they are more interested in showing the world, quote unquote, the world, not that the world really cares, honestly. But showing other Indians how wonderful they are than actually putting into place what you need. All this talk about an Indian institution going into the top 100, look, that's not going to happen until you start investing in a major way in education and higher education, which I fear this government will not do, not because they are bad guys, but because no government has. Since 1966, when it was first suggested that 6% of the GNP at that time, the Kothari Commission report suggested 6% of the GNP. It's been 54 years and it hasn't been done. Yes, they will do that. Thank you. Waiting in the right-wing government to come in. Sheikh Tariq Ali. Right-wing government, well, things will become difficult for many of us who don't like to think of ourselves as Hindus, or who certainly don't like to think of ourselves as, Hindutvavadis. Things will become difficult. Some of us will find it convenient to find virtues and values in such a government and switch sides. Some of us will continue to resist until we no longer can. So things are going to become difficult, but also interesting. The catalyst for violence in the post-COVID societal values, I fear it might be. I hope it won't be. Taj, we are already a long way into the seminar. So if you want to ask your questions, you can, or if you just want me to shut up.
No. I am not going to ask you any more questions because you have already answered that judiciary section. I was going to ask you because whatever is happening, that is the section that I was going to ask you. That judiciary is right now actually letting us down. And even in the post-COVID situation, things will not be as rosy as we expect it to be. So you have addressed that question. But one last thing that one of the early articles that you had written, which I read while I was preparing for another article from Desh about the COVID situation in education, you talked about 0 year, if I remember correctly. That, but somehow this idea appealed to me. That what would be so greatly wrong if we just allow 1 year to be stalled? But this idea didn't work out. It just fizzled. I don't know why. You have got any idea?
Yeah. Well, Taj, that would take a very long explanation. In brief, what I can say is that when I suggested the 0 year, what I was basically saying is this: that look, this thing has happened. We need to take it seriously. Let's deal with it. Then we resume our studies. That, unfortunately or fortunately, is what is happening. If you think about it, we stopped classes in the middle of March. It's now the end of August, and maybe the full syllabus has not been covered. It might not matter in a department of English or in a department of comparative literature. But can you imagine what will happen if a doctor, a surgeon opens a patient and says, "Oye, it is a pancreas. Pancreas to the poda hoyni,
It is almost a 0 yuan already.
So here looks at a bridge which has collapsed and says, "Oh, ও ওটা তো ক্যান্টিলিভারটা তো আমাদের সিলেবাসে কাভার্ড হয়নি, ওটা 2020-তে হয়েছিল। এটা আমি করতে পারবো না, কেবল স্টেট হলে করতে পারতাম। সো মাই আইডিয়া ওয়াজ দ্যাট লেটস নট ডাইলিউট
Yes.
the learning by insisting on completing things on time, because in any case it would be difficult. But that is something that could work if the entire country accepted it at all levels. My suggestion was very simple. You stopped academic activities in the middle of March 2020. Do it in throughout the rest of the year. Resume in 2021. I'm not saying you do nothing for a year. You do little things for a year, but go back to it. So those who would have appeared for their finals in May, June 2020 will take it in 2021. So the entire student population of the country basically, quote unquote, loses a year. But I would argue gains in terms of what they learn in terms of academic. It's possible only if and only if everyone adopted it. There's another aspect to it, which has to do with private universities. As we know, or perhaps not all of us do, almost 70% of all enrollment at the college and university level is in private institutions. And if you had to increase the session by a year, which is what a 0 year would entail, then you would have to pay for a further year of education, and that might not be acceptable. Sometimes I think that the UGC's insistence on conducting offline, online, real-time final exams is motivated private institutions, these private universities, where if you become a student, you must have an internet connection and a laptop. Many of the students in Jadavpur, and I'm sure in Alia, don't have it. But the UGC really doesn't care, because this entire government and all its arms seem to be working for the benefit of their favored crony capitalists.
Yeah.
That's why this is happening, Taj. I fear. And that's the short answer. That's the short answer. The long answer is more complicated and doesn't reflect very well either on us or our political masters or those who are at the center. That's it. I stop.
Okay. Thank you, Samantak Amjad sir and Hasina. Perhaps we are done. We have been going for quite some time. Samantak has been speaking for more than an hour and a half, I believe. Yes.
Yes, sir.
So, Hasina and Amjad sir, it's over to you now.
Well, I will. Hello.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I think we should wrap up, but I would like to thank again Professor Samantak Das for his illuminating lecture, as well as his answers in the Q&A session. When we were planning this webinar, actually, we thought that we should not only talk about the crisis, but also, talk about some way out of this crisis, some healing processes. So the interesting thing, I think the most significant thing, is that your lecture has not only talked about the crisis, the threats to democracy, but you have also put forth some suggestions how to face this crisis, how to stop the rise of authoritarianism, how to defend institutions, how not to obey in advance, etc. So I think the members of the audience will leave this session particularly with some hope. And that is, I think, the most significant take from this lecture of yours. So I would like to thank you again. Hasina.
Yes. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Amjad Hussain and Professor Samantak Das, sir, for such an insightful session. Here we come to the end of this session, and I would like to thank all the participants for being there with us and for their insightful questions as well. We will be moving on to the third session of this webinar today, 7 p.m. And our speaker tonight is Dr. Shumona Roy from Ashoka University. And she will be speaking on becoming a tree, notes from a logbook. So the link for this next session is the same. And I request you all to log in again at 7 p.m. in the evening today. So we end this session now. And thanks again to all of you.